What is going on, Tentacle? My name is Billy the Squint. Today I'm more worried about Elden Ring Multiplayer and Invasions than I probably have ever been about a FromSoftware game up to this point, and Elden Ring itself up to this point.
No, God!
And I'm going to explain why, because it is such a unique problem for FromSoftware to have, given the integration between single-player PvE, co-op PvE, co-op PvP, and single-player PvP.
That's a lot of P.
They have so many different facets of online community within these games that it is very, very difficult for them to balance out the game systems in a way so that it is both fair and fun for as much of the player base as possible. And I feel like the systems they have in place right now are the exact opposite, unfortunately. And I'm going to get into specifically why that is. But before we can get into the Elden Ring stuff, we need to go back a little bit and see what systems they have implemented in the past and kind of feel out what worked, what didn't. So starting with Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls Remastered, I did not participate in Demon Souls PvP, so I'm not going to comment on those systems in general. But given Dark Souls 1's PvP systems, you had a few modifiers that made it so that you could effectively opt out of PvP if you were a host. If you were an invader and wanting to invade up at the beginning of the game, you had these consumable items called cracked red eye orbs, and they were used up whenever you used them. Once you got so far into the game, you got a permanent version of one of these so that you can invade whenever you want. For the single player community, you had two options. You could play the game offline and completely forego co-op or PvP. You could play the game as a holo and forego both co-op and PvP. And you would also have the downsides of being holo. Or you could go in and play it like normal, open yourself up to the potential of invaders, have a co-op partner in there. You would also have the same potential as a solo player to being invaded. And these were just the ways that the game had to work. Yes, you had a consumable resource that would make you human so that you could bring people into your world if you wanted to call. It was a resource that needed to be spent. If somebody invaded you because you were human, because that was the only time you could be invaded,
Giggity, giggity.
and you died, taking you back to holo, you lost out on that resource effectively. But it also gave you a way of having people come into your world if you wanted them to. And I feel like this was an okay system. For their first mainstream way of getting this going, it was the best way, I think. And from what I understand, this is a big step ahead of the way Demon Souls did its invasions and its co-op. Dark Souls 2 shook things up a little bit, and they got rid of the necessity for a host to be in a specific form to get invaded. You could get invaded in Dark Souls 2 at any point of the game, whether you had your full health from being human, or no matter where you were down the hollowing line, invasions were still a possibility. They also had items that you could use to effectively reduce PvP. If you were holo, you were extremely less likely to get invaded than you would be if you were a human player. That is a good thing, in my opinion. You could also go to a bonfire of an area and burn a human effigy there.
Burning Man!
And it would bring you down to the bottom of the priority pool for invasions of that area. You would have to do this at every bonfire that you walked up to if you wanted to effectively avoid PvP, or you could just go into offline mode if you wanted to play through the game solo without having invaders coming in.
Giggity, giggity, giggity.
But this would also segment you off from co-op, whereas burning a human effigy did not segment you from the co-op experience. All very good things, with one major downside. The problem with Dark Souls 2 PvP is instead of having things level-based or weapon level-based like they would later in Dark Souls 3, they had a soul memory system where the game collects all the information on every soul, which is your experience points, that you have acquired throughout the game. Whether you used them or not, whether you died and lost them, every single soul that you acquire throughout Dark Souls 2 is calculated, and that is your soul memory. And you can only invade people within a certain range of your soul memory. So once you eventually played through the game so long, you would get to a point where you're only playing completely maxed out characters in PvP, and you would have to reset a character, start all over. Scholar of the First Sin worked on this a little bit with a ring that allowed you to basically be able to absorb souls, but they didn't count towards your soul memory, and you weren't able to use them as XP. So once you got into the PvP range you wanted, you could just equip this ring, and it would effectively make it so that you would no longer move outside of that range. It did take up a ring slot, which is unfortunate because rings were very, very valuable in Dark Souls 2 as they are in most games, but it was the only option that they had to a very flawed system of soul memory. Dark Souls 3 went back to the Dark Souls 1 way of doing things, but with a little bit of a twist. So you would need to be human, or embered in the case of Dark Souls 3, to be able to get co-opted or to be invaded by other players. You would also need to be within a certain range, level-wise, of a player, and you would have to have weapons of a certain level. So you couldn't be a level 25 character with a +9 weapon and go back to the starter area and wipe out everybody with that +9 weapon. It was a 3-level range for weapons, and then your overall level was, I think, like 15-ish levels one way or the other to be able to bring in co-op or PvP partners. If you were using password co-op, it went away with that level requirement, but it did scale your phantoms down to around where your level was. So I do think that this was a good system. It did have that opt-in system for both co-op and PvP that Dark Souls 1 had. If you wanted to go and do it in a solo experience without PvP or co-op, you could go offline. If you wanted to do co-op, you were going to need to be subject to invasions. And in Dark Souls 3's case, you get invaded as a co-op group significantly more than you do as a solo group. I don't know if there's something in the code that raises co-op groups priority, but it did seem to be the case. And this also went ahead with an item that they added to the game to help co-op as well. It increased the amount of phantoms that you could bring into your world, but it also increased the amount of invasions that happen in that world. It was called the Dried Finger, and like I said, it allowed you to bring in more co-op partners, but also subjected you to more invasions and multiple invaders at that.
Invasion.
It was really only used by gang squads or people that had a big group that wanted to play through the game together. But unfortunately for invaders, invading into these groups was not the funnest experience. And like I said, co-op groups always took the top priority when it came to invasions. So you were getting these groups more often than not. All of these games also had covenant-based PvP where people could invade in to help you fight off your invaders, or they were defending a specific area that basically became a PvP area in itself. They all had these different systems. Some more successful than others, but they were there, and they did kind of expand that overall PvP or co-op experience one way or the other. I also want to touch on Bloodborne PvP because while it was probably the worst implementation
that you could.
I also want to touch on Bloodborne PvP and co-op because while it was probably the worst implementation of PvP in a FromSoftware game, it was also the most unique. So there are 3 ways that you could get invaded in Bloodborne. 1, you were in a nightmare realm where a Bell Maiden was naturally spawned. 2, you were summoning for co-op, which spawned a Bell Maiden. Or 3, you were ringing a bell to PvP yourself, which also spawned a Bell Maiden into your world. The Bell Maiden was basically a tangible way for you to opt in or opt out of invasions, unless you were going into those nightmare realms where you had to go and actually seek out the Bell Maiden and kill her so that invasions would no longer be possible. The caveats to this is you could not have a Bell Maiden in your world if you had already beaten the boss of that world, and once you kill the Bell Maiden, you are opted out. You can no longer be invaded while doing that. So most co-op groups, what they would do is they would co-op and immediately rush to where the Bell Maiden spawned, because she always spawned in the same place in each area, and then they would co-op through the game like normal. Pretty easy, pretty good. The caveats to all of this was that if you had killed every single boss in the game, you were no longer able to effectively do PvP, and unlike Dark Souls 2 that had the method of bringing a specific area's world level up by burning a bonfire aesthetic at a bonfire so that you could open up PvP, Bloodborne didn't have anything like that, and the PvP scene quickly died outside of the nightmare realms and basically became Chalice dungeon dueling for the most part, and even the game's PvP itself wasn't the best, but we're not getting into that in this video. With all of these methods in mind, most groups were satisfied. Solo players had the ability to go offline if they didn't want to play. Co-op groups, while they were subject to invasions, it was split between them and solo players, and invaders didn't have to consistently get invading into co-op groups over and over and over again, making their experience less fun because while it can be fun to spank a group of gankers or a group of people in general, most people would rather have that 1v1 invasion experience. It just makes it more fair because they aren't inherently at the disadvantage. With Dark Souls 3, things started to shift in an awkward direction because co-op groups did get a higher priority on invasion lists. While solo invaders were still a possibility, it was much more likely for you to summon into gang squads and the like. This, on top of the item, the Dried Finger, made it so that you were even more likely to summon into these co-op groups that were now larger. And yes, you could potentially have a second invader in there helping you, but you were always at the numbers advantage in most situations. And I feel like all of these problems and more are exacerbated within Elden Ring in its current online state. Let me get into it. So, with Elden Ring's current PvP situation, what do you have? Well, you have the ability to not be invaded as a solo player by default. That's just the way it is. You don't have an opt-out system from invasions, you only have an opt-in system. So it effectively makes you in offline mode all the time while still being able to see bloodstains, signs from players, all of that stuff. Potentially a good solution for people that are only interested in solo PvE content, and that's it. If you are a co-op group and wanting to play through the game co-op, you are now 100% the brunt of all invasions unless a solo player has their opt-in item turned on, and I'll get to that here in a second. So not only do co-op groups get 100% of the brunt of invasions, potentially ruining their experience if playing the game through with friends is their only way of wanting to play through this game, but it also ruins the invaders' fun because they are pretty much going to be 100% subject to these groups of co-op groups. 2 people, 3 people if they have the tongue item turned on, and it just becomes anti-fun on potentially both of those fronts, considering that with solo play being an opt-in system for being invaded, there's going to be significantly less players opting in than there would be trying to opt out of it in other games. And then, with the opt-in item in question, the tongue item, it isn't even a perfect situation if you are wanting to be able to bring invaders into your world as a solo player. It is not a perfect solution because what it does is it opens up the floodgates to invaders, basically. As a solo host, you are now subjecting yourself to not only 1, but 2 potential invaders being able to come into your world just by using this item, just by wanting to have solo invasion as an option. To compound this issue is it effectively ruins the cooldown that you would have in prior games for invasions. If you got invaded in a prior FromSoftware game and you happened to defeat that invader or you died to that invader, you would then go on a cooldown where invaders wouldn't be able to come into your world for X amount of time unless you activated a certain item, which was in those games the Dried Finger and in this game the Tongue. Now, as soon as you activate that Tongue, you are pretty well immediately within the first 30 seconds of activating that item going to have an invader bring into your world. Say you beat that invader, great. Another 30 seconds goes by, another invader, and it's just going to be a constant bombardment of invaders coming in. There's not going to be any organicness to this experience. It's not going to be you going through the PvE content and then potentially getting invaded. It is as soon as you activate that item, it is floodgates, and you are going to have to multitask this pretty well consistently throughout your PvE experience with invasions enabled. To top it all off, you need to have a finger remedy to even be able to use the tongue. Yes, that is right. They added a consumable necessity for you to want people to invade into your world. Not to invade into other people's worlds, that's completely free. Not to summon in co-op, that is completely free. But if you want to bring invaders into your world, you have to pay a consumable. And while yes, it is a craftable item, and it shouldn't be that hard to come by, the fact that they have it gated off like this, I just find very, very odd. And another detriment to the experience of this line of player. So I ask you, Elden Ring community, Tentacruel community, who benefits from the online systems that FromSoftware has put in place with Elden Ring at this point? If you tell me the solo PvE player that had no interest in PvP, you would be correct. they are technically in a better state than they have ever been in because they can effectively have offline mode turned on, but still be able to see bloodstains and messages. That is a check on the good. What about solo players that want to be invaded? That is a big negative because they are going to have a constant floodgate of invaders coming in, potentially 2 invaders at that, and no stop to them with the current systems in place having no cooldown in between invasions. Now, I have a feeling FromSoftware is going to add a cooldown, and they didn't have this cooldown in place for the network test just so that they could stress test all of these systems. But in its current state, it is concerning. So what about the co-op groups? Well, they are going to be 100% the focus of invaders moving forward unless people are using this tongue, which in its current way, I don't see a lot of people doing because it's just not going to be a fun experience unless you want to, say, host a fight club or something like that. I see no benefit to actually using this because the experience of solo invasions is based off the organicness of the experience. You going through PvE content, potentially getting invaded, smiting that invader down, and then having that breather room to go and continue your PvE experience, go back to a bonfire, reset, and move forward. In this way, it's just one after the other, and that is not going to be the case. And if it is in the game in its current state, I have a feeling most people are not going to be using this item outside of fight clubs. So that is another check against the current online systems because the co-op groups are going to suffer constant invasions coming forward for people that want to invade. And speaking of people that want to invade, they are going to be invading into constant co-op groups, especially if people don't end up using this tongue item, which in its current state, I can't see them doing very much. It is a very, very sticky situation. That is another check against the current systems of the game. So yay, gang squads now have an infinite flow of invaders that they can bully into not wanting to invade anymore, which is going to make the PvP system go stagnant after so long. It is very, very unfortunate, and I am very concerned with the way things are going, especially with the infinite stun lock system from gang squads and the ability to summon in infinite amounts of co-op companions so that you basically don't have any downtime between having 2 or 3 co-op players at once that you're fighting as a single invader potentially. So what are my solutions? You can be negative all day, but if you don't have any solutions, then your word means nothing. My solutions come in a few different flavors. 1, make the tongue item not cost anything to use. If you want people to invade into your world, you should be able to do that for free.
For free!
2, make it so that you can only have 1 invader in your world at a time. For some reason, having the 2 invaders thing feels very weird to me, and I feel like that should be tied to if you have multiple friendly summons in your world, then it opens you up to a second invader. I feel like that is the more fair response than just having it tied to this item in general, especially when solo players, this is their only method of having invasions even happen. 3rd, create a cooldown between invasions. Whether you win or lose the invasion, make it so that there is a cooldown for the host so that they don't have invasions for so long after that, unless they reactivate the item in that way. If they wanted to immediately have people come into the world, deactivate the item, reactivate the item, they're good to go from there. But if they wanted to have that little bit of breathing room and have the item naturally work its way through, they have that option too. And lastly, I think this item should be done away with in general. I think at this point, we are to the point that they should just have a network setting for solo invasions turned on. That way, it opens you up to the same rules and stipulations that co-op groups would have with invasions, and make it so that that pool is spread out a lot wider. I feel like this would incentivize hosts to actually turn that mode on more than what the tongue item would. It would make it so that co-op groups had more breathing room so that not all the invaders were being funneled towards them, and it would make the invaders have a little bit of a break between gang squad after gang squad after gang squad, and actually be able to get a solo invasion every now and then. These are my suggestions. The game is not out yet. The game still has a ways to go. Hopefully from the network test, they have learned a lot from this, and some of these tricks are going to be implemented in the final version of the game. But this is just me bringing them up now because I feel like if the community doesn't speak up about them now, they will become problems later. And I don't want this many people in the community to have a bad experience with the online functionalities, because from that checklist we had, not many people are actually benefiting from Elden Ring's online systems at this point. But thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed what you listened to, hit a like down below. Also, consider subscribing to the channel if you didn't dislike the video. Please, thank you. Much love, Tentacrew. I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.